Hello and welcome. My name is Imran Mughal, your Reversec cyber host for today as we delve into the Q2 2026 Threat Reality Report, a publication from Reversec in collaboration with threat intelligence firm Orpheus. The report aims to bridge the gap between live threat intelligence and practical security testing, covering the most significant cybercrime, APT and hacktivist activity from Q1 2026, and importantly, translating that into actionable, testable scenarios for Q2 and beyond. Whether you're a CISO looking to prioritize investments or a security team planning your next red team exercise, the report was designed to help you move from intelligence to action. With me today, I have the Director of Orpheus Threat Intelligence Services, Tim West. Tim brings a deep cyber threat intelligence experience across government, financial services, and the wider security industry, having worked at the sharp end against some of the most advanced threats. Orpheus are Reversec's threat intelligence partner across a wide range of pen testing engagements. And I also have our very own Stuart Morgan, Principal Security Consultant here at Reversec. Stu's been at the forefront of red teaming since the early days of the UK's cyber scheme back in 2014. He now leads infrastructure and application testing, delivers regulated red team exercises, and has also helped shape the industry through developing and assessing CREST and cyber scheme exams. Thank you both for being here today. A reminder to our audience that you can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar, and I'll put them to our guests at the end. So let's kick things off a little bit with an overview of the Q1 threat highlights.
Well, firstly, thanks for having me. Great to be here. I think, frankly, the first quarter of 2026 was very busy in terms of kind of cybersecurity threats and incidents across the full spectrum, kind of nation states, hacktivism, financially motivated the cyber criminals as well. So I think I'm going to have to answer the question of the kind of themes that we've seen at quite a high level. And I think the first one, and it's quite a topic in vogue at the moment, is vulnerability exploitation. We've seen campaigns, what we might call an end-day campaign. So this is where a threat actor is managing to inject themselves between a patch being released or a security fix for a software or service, and actually that patch being deployed on an organization's estate. We're seeing quite collapsing timescales for discovery of a vulnerability to weaponization and exploitation from threat actors, and we are not seeing that same collapse in terms of pace to patch from organizations. And there's been a lot of cases of that over the last few months. Alongside kind of end-day exploitation, what we also see quite a lot of, and again, certainly over the first quarter of the year, is kind of zero-day exploitation, where vulnerabilities are being discovered and exploited before a patch is made available, sometimes before kind of organizations even know that the vulnerability is there in the first place. This is particularly damaging, and we've seen some really high impact incidents over the first quarter of the year, where these zero-day vulnerabilities have been present in services that are off premises. A good example is kind of attacks against Salesforce, for example, and Oracle's Business Suite, where kind of zero-day vulnerabilities in as-a-service applications were compromised.
Okay, thank you. And Stu, how are you, from the front lines, what's your perspective in terms of how these are shaping practical testing from your point of view?
And so fundamentally, there are, if you look at this at a high level, two routes to achieving those critical objectives. As Tim has mentioned, one of them is direct exploitation of weaknesses. Now, whether that's on-premise or owned systems, or whether that's third-party trusted systems. The other is compromising users that can lead to legitimate access to those systems. So rather than attacking the system directly, you attack the users that then have privileges to access something else, that can access something else that then can allow you to access those systems. And very often, my lived experience is that the successful attacks are ones that are a combination of those two things, often switching between them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Tim, one of the themes in the threat report, from what I've read, is around supply chain access. What are you seeing in terms of targeting outsourced IT help desks as a way in?
So, If you've been involved in the kind of cybersecurity industry over the UK in the last few months, you've been living under a rock if you haven't kind of seen some of the really heavily impactful attacks against kind of retail services particularly. There are a lot more where social engineers and criminals are targeting, again, these outsourced help desks. And the reason help desks are targeted is because they are inherently kind of highly privileged, right? They are kind of administrators, users and individuals who are able to kind of create, modify, remove kind of accounts, and I think as we kind of know, where where you can access an identity or utilize an identity to perform a task, particularly in a cloud system, you don't need to kind of develop malware or anything that might kind of touch an endpoint and be detected by other security tooling. And it's shockingly effective, particularly as quite a lot of the help desks that we see being compromised maybe fall outside of the security culture that you or your organization might try and cultivate. Those kind of staff that are administering your accounts don't have the same level of training that your staff does. They might not understand the kind of nuances of your language even. So this kind of trust boundary between privileged external users and an organization is being really heavily exploited to quite shocking effect, actually. And it's not just the real world that we see this being really effective. If you look at the Bank of England's CBEST thematic, where they kind of summarize all of the regulated tests engagements over the previous year, that was something that they had highlighted as something that was effective, even in simulated scenarios. So effective in simulations and as we can see in the real world as well.
Okay. And Stu, are you, in live engagements, are you actively simulating these style of attacks against help desks?
In short, yes, because it works. It's sometimes third-party or outsourced companies have a surprisingly high amount of privilege. Particularly if you outsource your IT management to a third party, then they, by definition, will have some sort of privileged access over your infrastructure, whether that's on-premise infrastructure, cloud, or a blend of the two. We see this in very nuanced ways as well. So as Tim alluded to, if you're launching a social engineering attack that's purporting to be from a help desk, in a small company, you'll probably know the person who deals with the IT, the vocabulary, the language, the way the messages, whether it's email, voice, are written. If it's written or described differently, then you'll sense that something just won't feel right. In an outsourced company, it's very rare to have that. So it's not uncommon for an email to come from an unusual domain asking you to do something, update something, or update a password, or do something on a portal that you perhaps don't recognize. And we often use attacks like this, and they are successful, whether that's calling up help desks to reset passwords, multi-factor authentication, tokens, credentials, or something else against a user, or impersonating the help desk for the same reasons.
Tim, is this a broader issue across all supply chains in general?
I think so. I mean, I think the underlying issue is the abuse of trust and not having kind of robust enough trust boundaries in place. And we see it in services. We see it in kind of human resource services like a help desk. We also see it in software as well. It's where you would kind of inherently trust that a third-party library or a plugin in a known and legitimate system is legitimate just because its host is. So if you're developing and you need to call in some third-party code, you've not really evaluated the security of that code. You don't know if it's kind of secure or whether even upstream it's been compromised. Similar with kind of plugins to your web browser or your development environment kind of tooling like Visual Studio Code, or actually quite a shocking amount of kind of software has the ability to extend its capability.
Okay. And where it's not this exploit, as we normally would have seen, where it's plugins, extensions, how are you seeing this play out to you?
Well, I think there's two slightly different parts to this. So there's, as Tim said, there's the tampering with code in repositories, so particularly vibe coding or bringing in libraries. If you're doing that, you probably, or you may not have the internal governance to go through and evaluate that source code. I mean, some of these libraries are absolutely huge. So they're brought in and it's assumed that they are coded securely. And if there's a vulnerability there, you don't know it's there, your code is vulnerable to it as well. The other one, which is more nuanced, is hidden functionality in a third-party tool or piece of software or system that it's not a vulnerability because it's legitimately there, but you don't really notice it, so you don't threat model for it. So a very classic example, it's been around over 10 years, is the idea of Office macros. I think everyone is very well aware of Word documents containing macros that run in plants. That's very well researched. But when you look at some of the other software that you may use that contains some ability to offer or some ability to execute code or perform nefarious activities, such as Chrome. So one of the attacks we use is a browser extension that's forcibly installed, and that will save copies of cookies and authentication tokens and send them to us. Sublime, the text editor. You don't really think of a text editor as being particularly malicious, but you can install plugins in that. So if you're able to, it's essentially copying a file to a specific place. Then when the text editor is opened, that code will run. Visual Studio Codes that you mentioned, so credit to MDSec, they did some research on this. It was released in like 2021, being able to run plugins within that. And these are legitimate functions. And in some cases, it's not really an exploit at all. It's just, in the case of Chrome, waiting for a user to log into a trusted system, and you can then hijack their access. And in fact, it reminds me of one test that we were on. It was a while ago now where we'd installed this. And we'd installed this on 5 machines, and the client had asked us a few days later for an update. But the problem was that the users who'd logged on were doing almost everything apart from the actual work. So none of them had logged into any of the systems that they needed to. So we did have to explain to the client that we were just waiting for someone to log into a trusted system so that we could then hijack their access. And in that case, it was actually one of the objectives.
Okay.
I think just to kind of add to that,
go ahead.
I mean, it's really worth noting that traditionally we've got layers of defenses to protect against kind of untrusted executable code that comes in from an untrusted source. We've got application whitelisting, we've got application or software catalogs and organizations, we've got Windows mark of the web, which kind of defines where something has come from an untrusted source. And actually these extensions on capability, or what is ultimately boils down to somebody else's code being ran, is bypassing a lot of these kind of layers of security that organizations have. And this is why, as Stu said, all you need to do is wait for the user to stop playing solitaire and start logging into things. And it's the same for the attackers as well.
Okay. So with what you've said, it's not all about breaking in anymore. It's about working with what users are already trusting. So it's actually become the threat has changed so much that you're able to work with what's already on systems that they already trust. So.
Yeah, that's a really key point as well. Not necessarily breaking in, it's logging in. And what Stu alluded to is he was targeting authentication information, whether it's kind of session IDs or cookie data. The same principles apply in the software supply chain attack vectors, where a poison repository is being loaded, being executed, and the first thing we see it doing is just trying to exfiltrate all of the kind of environment variables which define your API keys or whatever that enable you to authenticate to any services. So they're just stealing authentication data, because now, with deperimeterized networks and cloud-based services, it's all about authentication. The adage, really, true to an extent, is identity is the security perimeter.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems with this in terms of detecting is that this isn't malicious activity. Someone logging into a system they have access to is entirely normal. And if their authentication tokens, their session cookies, etc., have been removed, and we're able to use them and through proxying make it look like it's come from their IP address, it's really hard to tell the difference. It's really, really hard. So we're not looking for malicious, dodgy activity anymore. This is all legitimate, normal actions that are being performed, just in a more nefarious way.
Yeah. So it makes it very difficult to defend against. Okay, just a quick reminder to the audience, please do keep your questions coming in so that our guests can answer them towards the end. So we've talked about the first part of the report. Now let's go beyond what we've seen in Q1 and look a bit further ahead. What's around the bend? What kind of techniques should we expect to see more of, and what does that mean in practice from a defensive point of view?
Sure. So, I mean, first kind of point I always make when answering a question about what's coming up in the future is, or particularly where that future is time boxed over the next kind of few months, is, well, threat actors don't really operate in the same way an organization might, and they have kind of Q1, Q2, Q3 objectives, and they readjust their strategy every few months. So the maybe a bit of a kind of cheat answer is kind of more of the same, but there are a few kind of catalysts to what we've already seen that means I and a large part of the security industry and community thinks that some of those themes will accelerate. So the first being vulnerability exploitation. Again, if you've been living inside working in cybersecurity for a while, you'd have been under a rock if you haven't kind of heard a lot of the conversations around kind of how artificial intelligence is going to galvanize that vulnerability exploitation space. The truth is we don't really know yet whether it's going to be a net positive or negative. What we do know is a lot more vulnerabilities are being discovered, which is a good thing, if the defenders are able to process those, and broadly, good people finding vulnerabilities is a good thing, bad people finding them is a bad thing. But again, that pace of weaponization is being really kind of compressed, so there is a kind of risk of being overwhelmed. So AI is really giving and taking in that space. The more social engineering, we've spoken quite heavily on the effectiveness of social engineering, and really threat actors are trying to operate in that kind of grey boundary in trust zones. So we've spoken around outsourced kind of service desks and how threat actors are seeking to target that, but in reality, threat actors target business process. And that gets worse the more complex that business process is, and the more that complexity is shielded from a user. Like, users are quite good now at not typing in their password into an untrusted website, except with kind of cloud security and Microsoft 365, you have to type in your password sometimes 3 or 4 times to authenticate. So we are unlearning quite a lot of what we've previously learned. And we see things like fake capture, where, again, users are trained now to complete an arbitrary task, a silly task sometimes, to achieve their goal, accessing a website. And attackers know this, so they just replace these arbitrary and silly tasks with another arbitrary task that happens to give them access to your device. So attackers will really follow the business process and the users, relying on that kind of hidden complexity to come up with new, more novel social engineering techniques. Again, it's a bit of a high-level answer because I don't know what tomorrow's fake capture is going to be, but it will entirely depend on how we operate as users. And finally, the software supply chain. I think, and maybe this is the world according to Tim, but we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg with this. This is inherently a cascading issue because of the interconnected nature of software libraries. If you compromise one, and that's then being exploited, being kind of pulled down and executed by 100 more. In theory, you've compromised now 100 more if each of those have, nth parties. So we don't have a lot of visibility into software. We can see open source, we can't see closed source. So there is almost certainly a really hidden, huge hidden surface to that attack vector, and it's probably going to rear its ugly head over the next few months.
Okay. Based on the changes to human behavior that Tim's described there, how are you able to combine some of these insights into creating end-to-end attack techniques?
Yeah, so it's changed. I found attacks have changed. So certainly over the last 10 years, we've seen that evolution. I think we all know that. Something that has been a consistent factor across all of them are credentials, passwords being in text files, common things are common. And I'm not saying that the world revolves around that, but it is a very, very consistent finding. And whilst that remains a very low sophistication way of being able to move across systems, attackers will continue to do it. So I think it's important that the investment in tomorrow's security doesn't ignore the lessons of the past as well. And we know social engineering is a very effective way of being able to gain access both initially and privilege escalation. So managers having to click on links to authorize holiday and authorize other things is not uncommon. And being able to perform internal phishing, it does have its uses. We do that. What I have seen, my lived experience with phishing, is that the old days of sending 1,000 emails saying, "Dear user, please click on this link," that tends not to be successful anymore. People are quite well trained in not doing that. However, if it's a more targeted attack, so that plus minus AI, deepfake, etc., but if it's a more targeted attack with some benefit to that user, I find that it tends to be quite successful. So if Tim here was hiring and I sent him my CV and had a conversation with him first and introduced myself and then asked him to open the document, and for whatever reason it doesn't open because he needs to open it in a particular way or grant some permission, Tim's much more likely to do that if there's a relationship between us, rather than if he just receives an unexpected email out of the blue with a document that he's expected to somehow open and enable content on. And I think your point's really, really good, certainly around trained behaviour. So captures, e-learning, people press next all the time and very few people actually read through the entire hour's worth of slides and video material. So this fast clicking next just to get rid of it, it's become a learned behaviour. And some of our phishing campaigns actually take advantage of that. In fact, there's one, again, it was a while ago, but one of our phishing campaigns was a phishing training session. So one of my colleagues had actually built an entire phishing training session and sent that out from the IT security team, purportedly, and users were completing it left, right and centre, and it had advice and videos, and it also ran code. So I think you'll find that attackers will take advantage of these new nuances, these new learned behaviours in ways that perhaps weren't obvious when they were first designed.
I think it's actually a really good point, particularly, and ties really well in with the Bank of England's thematic for 2025. And actually what they saw was, we are maybe in the attention economy, we're now looking at the kind of shiniest new kind of AI security tools, but in reality, the attacks that are effective are the technically unsophisticated ones, the simple ones, quite a lot of the time. You don't need to keep pushing the boundary and kicking the rope of, the forefront of, technological offensive security to actually have some pretty good effect in most networks.
No, and I think there is a lack of understanding sometimes about what the purpose of some of these actions are. So you mentioned captures. Capture was always designed as a way of stopping someone automating. It's not a defense against AI, but sometimes it's thought of as that. So you end up with some quite strange security controls appearing in good faith, but it's because they're not actually effective against the attacker that people think they're effective against. So you end up with some bypasses happening purely because of a lack of shared understanding, more so than the control failing in itself.
Okay. Thank you for those insights. I think just moving across to the real world now in terms of application, just coming to you again, Stu, how do you think organizations can actually validate their resilience against some of the threats we've discussed here? What are your recommendations?
So picking up on your words carefully, if the question is validation, then a red team can be quite helpful. A red team is a measurement tool. Red teams don't fix things in themselves. They give you information. They allow you to exercise your preventative, detective, and response controls. What you don't get is a one-to-one findings to recommendations mapping, because that, in my experience, tends to oversimplify the underlying root cause problems. There's other approaches as well. So sticking with the teams, there's purple teaming, which is a collaborative way of working, where attackers and defenders will work together, and there's that feedback iteration loop that's a lot tighter than in a red team. You often get more system evolution and more improvements with that, but what you don't get is the end-to-end exploratory attack chain. And I think the choice you make really has to be the thing that will influence that is what you're trying to achieve. I'm not convinced, for example, of the benefits of the annual compliance red team. And I might be talking out of red teams here, but genuinely, if there is a compliance document that says you must do this exercise every year and no one really looks at the results. The problem is that you end up with a lot of investment in this activity. It gives you lots of good information, but then there has to be the business process to actually interpret and resolve those issues. And I remember one client saying to me once, the problem is we have tests all the time and we get tested so often we can't actually fix anything. And that's always stayed with me. This was actually in a pub after a job, but it stayed with me because it's so true.
Okay, thank you. And Tim, how does your team take, I think everyone would like to understand your process. How does your team take the threat intelligence and turn it into the kinds of usable scenarios that are actually useful for clients, customers around the world?
Yeah, so I mean, at a really high level, that's our purpose, particularly in these kind of threat-led penetration tests. It's our job to make sure that how the test is being conducted is reflective of the real world, and we're not just in some hypothetical or academic scenario. And the first thing to note is, Orpheus runs a team of kind of professional threat intelligence analysts, and that's kind of what we do every day. We look at what's going on in the world and in the cyber threat landscape, and what we would like to do is apply that to an organisation in the scope of the test. So once we've got the scope, that might be the systems you want to test, the functions you want to test with key systems, or as broad or as narrow as is kind of realistic and requested. We perform quite a involved bit of research over the threat surface of that organisation. What information can we gather about the systems that you want to test? It might be a kind of human resources system or something. Not just from the technical perspective, vulnerabilities, services open, passwords leaked, etc., but also, from what we can find in the deep and dark web, the surface web, maybe overexposed kind of information about a particular service, particular individuals that could be leveraged by Reversec or another kind of, security consultancy to actually achieve the real world scenarios that we will then come up with. And we do that by essentially overlaying that kind of really intimate knowledge of a network with our really intimate knowledge of what's going on in the kind of threat landscape. From that mesh, we can perform various analytical techniques to come up with, the most likely, the most impactful kind of scenarios that we would put to the red team for them to go ahead and execute.
Yeah, and I think that advanced nation threat actors, I'm not sure you would agree, they will have some internal knowledge of an organisation before attacking it. The days of just sending opportunistic phishing emails, I think, are long gone now for the sophisticated advanced threat actors. And the threat intelligence gives us that exposure as a red team. Our duty is to perform and investigate, perform these attacks emulate as close as we legally can the actions of a sophisticated advanced threat actor. And without the threat intelligence, there isn't really anything to guide other than just personal experience, which then means that the tests are arguably not as reproducible. So we do try to accurately emulate the attacker's behaviour. One of the things we then do from, say, the work that Tim's done, will be given or provided with a series of scenarios, and we'll need to agree objective success criteria. So a classic and relatively regular objective may be deploying ransomware. Now, we're not actually going to deploy ransomware on the client's network, so we will agree with them what would constitute a successful objective. So that might be being in a position to deploy code across a large part of their estate. That might be actually deploying benign code. And in fact, in one very recent case, we've written bespoke code that will perform encryption of some very specific files as a proof of concept. And it then deletes the original files. And this is being done in production, but in a very contained way, because it gives them the opportunity to exercise their exfiltration controls as well. And that tends to be very, very client specific, and it's very, very targeted to the threat intelligence that we provide.
Okay, thank you very much, both. I think before we get to our audience's questions, just a few key takeaways from what we've discussed. Based on everything we've talked about, from a threat intelligence all the way through to testing, what should organizations actually be doing differently? Perhaps in one takeaway that they can action tomorrow, for instance? Tim, what are your thoughts?
I think networks are becoming deperimeterized, decentralized, which means that the onus on your security layers shouldn't necessarily be on this kind of defined perimeter. Endpoint detection software is really good, but it's predicated on finding malicious behavior based on a normal baseline. As we kind of move to a distributed kind of information system, let's say, you now need to find kind of heuristic markers of malicious behavior based on abnormal baselines, which makes it quite difficult. And I think really the best tool for organizations to be able to do this is to make sure that their kind of proactive security measures, controls, whatever you want to call them, aren't as part of this kind of regular testing cycle that they might not be able to actually remediate, but they are doing kind of their EASM, their attack service management, their cloud security posture management, their third-party supply risk management as BAU, as a kind of regular, I'm going to say it again, BAU operation within their security center.
Okay. And Stu, from your point of view, what do you think could help prepare organizations before they carry out a red team or whatnot in terms of the types of engagements they should be preparing for?
So I'll say again, red team for me is a measurement activity. It doesn't fix vulnerabilities. It helps you to identify attack chains. It doesn't give you a list of vulnerabilities. And very often the vulnerabilities or the issues, the critical path, the components of the attack chain that lead to a compromise or significant compromise, there's often a fundamental root cause underneath the vulnerabilities that you actually find. So as an example, if a user has got excessive privileges in Active Directory, they're in a group and no one realized that group has more privileges that in some convoluted way allows you to access something of significance, the solution isn't to remove the person from that group and then end the matter there. My advice is to try to not contribute further to the security debt, and rather than patching it, using the term slightly wrongly, rather than just removing that instance of the issue, actually invest in understanding the underlying problem. And that may be an overly complicated permissions hierarchy. And if we do the sort of catch and release almost, you're just chasing the vulnerabilities as they come up, the root cause may not be fully resolved. And then we end up in this cycle of repeatedly doing tests and something new turns up every time and then that's fixed. And I don't think that's always the most efficient way of solving the problem in the long run.
Okay, thank you very much both. That brings us to our Q&A section. So I would just have a scroll through to see what our audience has been saying. We have a question in which is asking, what is the security control that you see clients implementing and has the total opposite effect?
I'll pick that one up if that's okay. So one of this is one of my little bugbears. It happens quite a lot. Is when there is a sole reliance on policy-based controls. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the common findings, certainly in my lived experience, is credentials, tokens, passwords in one form or another in configuration files, on shares, in text files, in spreadsheets, etc. And there's very, very often policies and e-learning that people have had to go through that tells them not to do this. And I think so that I can probably feel most CISOs thinking, God, yeah, I know we keep telling them not to and people are still doing it. And my advice in that situation is rather than trying to legislate against a behavior, make it as easy as possible to behave securely. So in that real example, if you legislate against having passwords in configuration files, it's really important to understand why they've been put there in the first place. And in most cases, it's because there's just no alternative within the company ecosystem for them. People don't come to work to do a bad job. So as a real example, one client I worked with, we found one of our targets was client data and it was found in company emails. And there was a policy that said, don't internally email client data. The problem was that if you have two people, this was around COVID time, and if you have two people working remotely, the company had no other way of sharing files. So the security team was saying, do not do this, it's insecure. But the people doing the work needed to share data, and there was no other company approved way of doing it. So they were acting in what they felt was the best interests of the company. So shouting at and sacking all the people who did this isn't a solution. The solution is to put something in place as an alternative. So another real example was a client who had banned downloading and execution of own programs. Not uncommon, a very sensible security control. So if you've got a company laptop, you can't just download programs off the internet and run them. The problem was that as pressures increased, the team were expected to work faster, and there were tools out there that would help them. But the company's approval process, the client told me it's about 2 to 3 months, I think, to get a program installed and approved. So what was happening was users were using web-based solutions instead, cloud-based solutions. They were using these web-based solutions because their web browser worked. It technically got through the control, and what ended up happening was a load of that customer's client information was now in uncontrolled cloud spaces. And if you actually break that down, the problem, it wasn't a vulnerability, it was simply a behavior. But users were being told to do their job, but they weren't able to do it because they didn't have the right tools available. So my genuine advice to our watchers with this and our listeners is not just to legislate against poor behavior. If you're going to ban something, and that something has happened because there is a business need for it, you really need you need to provide the users with an alternative that works, that fits into their workflow. I think that seems reasonable.
Yeah.
Tim, any other insight on from your point of view?
Yeah. So, I mean, thanks for answering first. Give me a bit of a chance to think, actually. So, maybe a kind of 2 higher level points. I mean, the first is whenever you kind of introduce a productivity or security tool, there are potentially unintended consequences for that. I mean, maybe we have to talk about AI, but using AI to develop and vibe code, that means you're now unsupervised in your importation of third-party software libraries, and we discussed the issues with that. And secondly, let's look at, and it doesn't quite answer the question, but it's kind of skirting the edges, so hopefully you'll allow me this bit of rope. But a firewall, right? And a firewall, an enterprise-level firewall, is, I guarantee you, down as a control, not as a risk, in most organizations. Now, enterprise-level firewalls are getting compromised all the time. We see it, not a month goes by without a major enterprise-level firewall being compromised. And what do organizations do when the security control or technology that they put in is the vector by which they are being kind of attacked? A lot of them have to rely on lateral movement, actually, where the actors then move from that foothold into the network, which, in my view, isn't particularly good enough. We need to be as proactive as possible and not reliant on detecting a step or two into a kill chain. So I think that's my kind of best answer. Now, it isn't necessarily.
No,
I'm not saying don't use a firewall by any means.
Yeah.
But they can't rely on it as the be end end all.
As a control. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's an infection vector in itself.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for that. Okay, we've got another question here. What's the biggest blind spot you're seeing when organizations try to translate threat intelligence into real world testing? This might be one to throw at you first, Tim.
I think everybody wants the sexy scenarios, the most technical. I think we've kind of touched upon it already. It's not always the most cutting edge attacks that are the ones that are successful. It's the ones that are basic, tried, tested, trusted by adversaries and underpin kind of basic fundamental vulnerabilities, i.e. kind of a human and relative trust boundaries. So I think that's my answer. Instead of focusing on the new sexy TTPs, there is a huge surface of kind of reliable, trusty attack vectors that are shockingly effective.
Stu, any words of wisdom to add on there?
No, I would agree. I think not understanding the true implication of trust boundaries. So we've talked about the supply chain attacks and that divergence between the traditional supply chain, as in you've sent me a product or a piece of software, I'm using it, and I haven't been able to analyze it or look for vulnerabilities in it myself, and the unexpected or unknown legitimate functionality which EDR solutions won't always detect because that's normal for the program. It's not doing anything unusual, so there's no anomalous behavior.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got another question here. Where should we focus our testing first, given that the most successful attacks exploit systemic weaknesses rather than new vulnerabilities? I'm going to throw that to you first, Stu.
So in the old days, back in the day, there was this view that we have to protect everything. We have to, perimeter controls are key. These days, and this is a view supported by the NCSC, these days, we don't have to apply, if you can, that's great, but if you can't apply every single security control to absolutely everything because networks are so complex and, as Tim has said, a lot more decentralized now, my advice would be to threat model, look at your most significant critical assets, the things that are going to cause your business significant harm or the economy significant harm, and then look to protect those. So invest in those and then gradually widen that sphere. Realistically, it's the most effective option that you have. And it's not ideal in that with an unlimited budget, everything would be in scope, but it's in real life. You just can't shut down an entire business for 6 months while there's a whole architectural review and rebuild of your domain.
Okay, thank you, Stu. Tim, what would you have to add to that?
I'd like to see a focus on resilience, as maybe I think you were skirting around there. You can't secure everything, particularly as we are now operating in a off-premise and decentralized environment. You kind of have to assume breach because it's quite likely that you will be impacted, maybe in the nth degree, but you'll be impacted nonetheless from kind of cyber attack. And this means that really organizations need a focus on resilience as much as security. Can you recover? Do you understand maybe your concentration risk across your third-party suppliers? If an organization goes down, what does that mean for me in terms of data theft? What does that data theft in the hands of attackers then mean for me, maybe a bit more directly, but also what does it mean for the continuity of my kind of services? When we talk about cyber attack, we largely refer to the CIA triad. It's not just, the confidentiality of data maybe, but the integrity and availability as well.
Okay, I think we're closing in on our end time, so we might be able to get one very quick last word in. How can we better defend against social engineering attacks, especially the vishing you mentioned and SSO credential theft? Stu, in a few words.
Consistency within the organization, if you want 5 words for it. That's a very, very broad question. There is no one straight answer for that, but lots of divergent logging in technologies are just going to cause users to be blind.
No, that's fair. And I've got 30 seconds for you, Tim.
Same question?
Same question.
Simplify. Social engineering attacks work because somebody on the other end of the phone or your email don't fully understand how the inner workings of a system work. So it's all around kind of user understanding.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our guests today, and thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully that's given you a useful perspective on what we're seeing in the threat landscape and how that's actually playing out in the real world. As always, feel free to reach out to our guests if you'd like to continue the conversation, and don't forget, check out the latest research from both Reversec and Orpheus. Thank you very much, and goodbye for now.